Okay, so we've done our simple example using Express. So I'm actually going to close this project, and instead we're going to create another project using the Express generator. And then we'll kind of work with this site, instead of creating new ones, we'll continue to work on this site pretty much the rest of the semester, or maybe right up until the end. So just before we do that, maybe we should figure out, so we'll build an application where we can do create, read, update, delete. We can maybe upload files, we'll add authentication, we'll add social login, we'll add a whole bunch of those features. Sort of like our, the computer store we built last semester, but maybe we'll build something else. So if there's any ideas of what we could build, I have a few ideas of my own I can throw out. Or if anybody has any suggestions of what we should build our mean stack site, what the subject of it should be, throw it out. Floor is open. Okay, so we could do that, some sort of like a music library, that would be an option. Other suggestions? My thought was we could build, social innovation platform. Okay, we could also do a kind of looking around the room and seeing how many different countries and cultures we have represented. We could even make up a food library, like tell me your favorite dishes from home, right? We could look at uploading photos and actually get to learn a little bit about some of the stuff that people like to eat from from home. I'm seeing a few nods, we'll maybe try that. Okay, so in my terminal, stop your server, we don't need this site. But my command prompt, I'm inside my lesson 4 folder. So I want to go outside. So I want to go up one level to my root folder. So if you just run the command cd ... that will change directories and go up one folder. So just run your command cd ... and then you should just be in the root wherever you've been creating your files. So I'll jump over to the Express site for a minute. And I'll kind of walk through the process. It's actually not very complicated. Most of what's here is just output, but I'll explain how we're going to use the generator to build our new site. Okay. So the command to actually, it says you can actually install the generator one of two ways. The old way was to do npm install -g express-generator. The new way has a bit of a shortcut. They have this command now that's available as of node 8 or later, which I think all of us have, because I think most of us are on like node 10 or higher. So the shortcut is run npx express generator. That will install the package globally. I'm not going to do it yet. I'm just going to kind of walk through what we're going to do, and then we'll do it together. So we'll install the generator, and then that gives us access to the express command. And when we run the command express, that creates a new site using the generator that scaffolds everything. But there are some options here, and one of them is important. By default, when we say express, and then we name our project, one of the options is, so Express lets us choose different styles of syntax for our views. So our views could have different extensions or different coding styles. If we don't specify what kind of view template engine we want, by default, it's going to use a syntax called pug. And pug is kind of neat because pug will basically, for example, if you want an H1 tag, you just literally type the characters H1 and pug will render the opening and closing tag for you. So it saves you from having to do all the tagging. The problem with pug is it's very, very fussy because it nests things based on your tabs. So if you want an H1 tag and then you want a div nested underneath, you have to make sure you put a tab before the div tag. So if you mess up the tabs, it's really easy to break your page and hard to debug. So when you're good at pug, the code is really fast and light and elegant, and you can generate your views really quickly. The bad news is if you mess something up, it takes a long time to fix them because it's so particular about tabs and spaces. So for that reason, I prefer to shy away from Pug. I've used it before in class, and like I said, students found when it worked great. But when it didn't work, it was kind of a nightmare to fix. But that's the default, so you have to be careful. If you don't specify a different template engine when we use the generator, you get Pug. So the one I want to use, and in the past I've used to use EJS, but now we've moved to using one called Handlebars. And I like Handlebars because it's fairly easy to code. It looks simple, so you can easily see your HTML and your server-side values. They're fairly easy to delimit. And the other thing is the Handlebars syntax, as I mentioned, is very similar to Angular syntax. And we're going to add Angular into our UI later in the course. So we won't have to learn two completely different syntaxes for rendering our user interface. So that means when we create a new Express application with the generator, we're going to want to use this as part of our command, --HBS. That will mean every time we create a new view, it will automatically get an HBS extension and handle the HBS formatting. So it would look something like this: express --view equals HBS, and then whatever we want to call the name. And this is the directory structure that we'll get. It'll create a package.json, it'll create an app.js. That's kind of like our main server file, like the server.js file. So the server gets started in app.js, that's where our database will get connected. And then we'll get a public folder with a JavaScript and images. We can also create, if we want to create CSS, which we will, we'll create a style sheet subfolder in public. So any static public assets go there. The roots, we're going to rename this. Express has this really weird terminology. A root is a controller. So we're going to rename that folder from roots to controllers. And it'll build a couple of simple controllers for us. Oh, sorry, it does give us a default style sheet. And then all of our views will go inside a subfolder called views, much like they do with the Visual Studio scaffolding. There's no model folder by default. We'll add the models in next week when we start working with MongoDB. So in Visual Studio, when you say, I want an MVC app, you get a models, a controllers, and a views. In Express, you get a roots, which is the controllers, and you get views. It doesn't give us models. And then there's a bin, which is where the compiled folder goes. And then when we're done, once it's done scaffolding, we need to change directories to go inside of our new project folder, and we need to run npm install, which will download any of the dependencies that the Express generator needs. So we basically need to run 4 commands to set this up. So our first thing we need to do is we need to install the Express generator globally. So we can use either of these 2 commands, nps express-generator or npm install -g express generator. Either one should install it globally. So I will run the command because it's shorter, npx express-generator. So this isn't creating our project yet. This is installing the scaffolding tool. So it's going to go to npm. We can ignore that warning. Destination is not empty. Continue. Yes. No, I didn't need to say yes to that. That's okay. So here's your command. So once I've installed the generator, I want to create our project. Or I don't know what we want to call it. Global food, So here's the command. To create my new project with scaffolding, we write the command express -h. So we use Handlebars as our view engine. Sorry, I think minus HBS. I'll double check the syntax. And then we'll call it global food. Yeah, good, Joe? Express minus HBS and global food. If we don't include the minus HBS, we're going to get pug instead as our template engine. Okay. I think Express lied to us because it said it doesn't recognize the express command. So their documentation says if we have node 8, we can run npx express generator. I don't think that worked. So I'm going to try this version, the npm install -g express generator. We'll use the old version. You can just use the letter I instead of install. That works as well. Yeah, it should install it globally if you're on Windows in your user app data roaming npm.
That's where like actually installs the packages, like the files.
Yeah, so it looks like the instructions are misleading. So the npx actually creates an express scaffolded application, but the instructions say for earlier versions install as a global package. Okay, we can just ignore or delete those files that got created. It did the same on mine, I was just ignoring them. So it installs package.json, app.js, public routes, and views, and bin. I'll just delete those. If they're there, it's no big deal. Won't break anything. You know what? Maybe I misunderstood the instructions in the command. I was assuming the npx command was to install it. I think it's to actually run the tool. That's okay. So now I'll try this one again. So I've installed the generator globally. I want to now run express -HBS and whatever you want to call your project name. So this should create a new folder called global food, and then the generator should scaffold the application inside that global food directory. We'll try this again. You can see, I'll just leave the command up for a minute. Okay. Second time's a charm. And it gives me a little warning saying, this is actually should now be -view equals HBS. But it did work. So it created the global food folder with our public, routes, and views, subfolders, and it created 3 HBS templates: error.hbs, index, and layout. And then it gives us 2 instructions at the bottom. Change directory, so enter your new folder, and then install the dependencies with npm install. So those 2 instructions you see now, we want to follow those commands. And then it says to start it, you can just run npm start. We'll use nodemon instead. So I will change directories to go into our new project folder. So just do cd global food. Again, I'm just following the instruction here. So do cd global food and enter. And then lastly, npm install. So it added 63 packages. We'll deal with this npm audit later. It's saying one of the dependencies has a vulnerability. We'll leave that for now. It's nothing we've installed directly. It's one of our dependencies has a dependency on something else, and that one we probably want to update the version on. We'll deal with that later. So I'm going to open the project now in my code editor. So we've got our new global food project that the generator scaffolded. And we can have a look at what's in here. So it looks a little bit like a .NET project, but smaller. So there's a bin. This is where our server-side code actually gets compiled. And it says our port. Notice the port that it gives us, port 3000, which is what we've been using. So our app is set to run on port 3000 by default. We could change that if we want to, but that's our default. We've got our node modules. So here are all the dependencies. So all of these packages are included. Our public is for our static assets, images, client-side JavaScript, and style sheets. It gives us a very simple CSS starter file, which you can get rid of or modify. We've got our routes. So these are our controllers. We'll come back and look at these. Here are our views. So we've got 3. Here's our index view. And you can see what the handlebars syntax looks like. Anybody have an idea where the syntax got its name, the template? Yeah, the curly brackets, they look like handlebars. This is also, there's another similar template library called mustache. So other people say it looks like a mustache turned on its side. So this is how, so what do you suppose when we see those handlebar tags around this value, what does that suggest about that value? Yeah, it's coming from somewhere else, right? That's not hard-coded HTML. That's basically a server-side value, kind of like the equivalent of putting the @ symbol into a view in ASP.NET. The @ symbol means that that value is coming from the server. So any dynamic values, whether these are variables or data from our database, we render those inside the handlebar tags. And we get a layout file. Again, kind of similar to what Visual Studio gives us, but much simpler. It's just a link to our style sheet and a dynamic heading and body tag. Here's our main server file. So it includes some stuff we've already seen. It includes Express. It's linking to our 2 controllers. It says we're using HBS for our views. And it's already automatically got cookie parsing if we want to use cookies. It says our static assets are inside of the public folder. So that means if we want to link, notice our link to our style sheet is inside of public style sheets. Here's the style. But we don't need to put public in the path here, because we're saying any static assets automatically are in the public path. That's set out globally. And then here's our routing. Here's our URL paths. So any requests at the root are handled by our index controller. Any URLs that start with the word users are handled by our other controller. We've got 404 handling as well. And this line is important. We'll see this in a lot of files. Anybody have an idea what line 41 does? What this export line does? It's really important, and we're going to use it in most of the files we create. Envy? Exactly. So in ASP.NET, we would make our controllers or our models public, so the models and controllers could talk to each other. In Node, exporting something makes that file public so other files can access it. So if we took or commented this line out, it would break the whole thing. Nothing would run because this file would be private and inaccessible to the rest of the application. So if we want to run this, we can just pull up our terminal and we can just run nodemon. We don't even need to say what file to load because nodemon actually runs the compiled version of this, which lives in the bin ww folder. That's this file up here. So it gets compiled and runs. So we can just use nodemon. The server will start. Let's go to localhost 3000 and see what we get. So we get a quick template site that says welcome to Express. And we'll kind of trace where that output is coming from. So we haven't changed any code. All we've done is set it up, installed the dependencies, and started it. So it says Express here in a heading, Express in our browser tab title, and Express in the body content. Anybody having trouble getting theirs to start, or are you able to run it in your browser? Okay, if your nodemon isn't working, you can just try npm start. That should also launch it. npm and then a space and then start. Try that, Valkarn, let me know if it runs. So we should dissect a little bit how this works. How is it when we hit localhost 3000, we get this view loading? So we have to look at the URL routing first. So any requests at the root path are handled by this index router variable. So I'm looking in my app.js on line 22. It points to the index router variable on line 7. And this file is linked to our index controller inside of roots. So if I go to my roots folder and open up my index.js, we're requiring Express. We're creating an Express router. So this object is used to map the different paths and types of HTTP requests. So when we have a GET request in the root, we're doing something we haven't done before. Before we've been calling res.send or res.write. What do you suppose the render command does here that I've highlighted? Yeah, it's loading a particular view. Which view? It's loading the view called index, which is here inside of views. Here's index. We don't have to specify the file extension, because in our app.js, when we set it up, we said the view engine is HBS. That was what that minus HBS did. The views will always have HBS extensions. So it's not necessary for us to refer to the extension. So load the view called index. And then what's happening here? Yeah, so we're passing in some data. We're loading the view and we're passing it some dynamic data. And whenever we're passing data, it's got to be as a JSON object. So we're creating a variable called title. We're giving it a value. So then when our view loads, we're displaying that variable called title in our handlebars braces. So you notice it's in the H1 tag and it's in the title. There's no header or footer though. So where are the header and footer if they're not in the index view? Yeah, so inside of the layout, it also uses the title in the HTML title tag, and then the page body gets injected inside the layout. Very similar to the templates we used in Visual Studio. Now there's one thing, so there's our index. Let's trace what happens if we go to /users. We get this response. If you try /users, we'll get this response. If we go to our app.js on line 23, and your code should be identical to mine because we haven't changed it, we're mapping any path that start with the URL users. It's being mapped to the users router instead, which is up here on line 8. The users router refers to our users controller, which is here. And it also has a get method in the root. And right now it just sends this response back. Doesn't load a view, it's just sending plain text back. And both of our controller files are public. Without this last line, our application would break. But I comment out this line that, as Envy said, makes it public. I try to reload my home page. I've now gotten an error because that controller can't, my app.js can't load that controller without it being public. If I go and look in my terminal, this router.use requires middleware means it's calling the controller, but it can't find it because that controller is private when it is not exported. So I need to put that back. So let's try changing a couple things. What if we want to change the word express on this page? We want it to say COMP2106 Global Food Market. Where would we go to change that? Right, we'd go to the roots and index.js, and where in here would we change it? Yeah, we'll replace the word express with and if NodeMon is running, we should just be able to save that change and go back and refresh our home page. And we should see Global Food Market in 3 places: the browser tab, the H1 tag, and the welcome to paragraph. So it now updates those values here, here, and here. Now, most of what the generator gives us works pretty well. There's one thing I don't like about it that I'm going to change in my project. It's up to you whether you change it in yours or not. I find the name of this folder is really confusing. The files inside are controller files. They handle the logic of the application. Yet the Express generator has decided to call that folder roots. I want to rename this folder, and any paths like app.js that point to my roots folder, I'm going to rename that to controllers. So this is optional. You don't have to do this. in WebStorm, if I right-click my folder and choose Refactor, I can then choose Rename. And I'm going to rename it to Controllers. And by default, I have these checked off. Search for references. That means any place in the project that has the path/roots, WebStorm will automatically rename that path to /controllers for me. Again, totally an optional step, but I think it makes the project a little easier to understand. So I'm going to refactor that. So now my folder's named controllers, and in app.js, both lines 7 and 8 automatically, that word roots gets changed to controllers. I won't see any difference in my project, should still run fine. Again, that's completely optional. I prefer it. It makes more sense to me this way. And I might even name their variables are called index router and users router. I might rename those as well to index controller and users controller, just because that makes more sense to me. You absolutely don't have to do this. So now we want to create, I want to create a new page. This is basically given us, there's really only one page, the index.hps. There's an error page, and the layout is not a complete page, it's just a template with basically our header and footer. So if we wanted to create an about page, we basically need to do two things. What would we need to do to add an about page to this? Yep, so we'd need to create a root, and which controller would we put that in? We got three choices. We have a index controller, we have a users controller, or we could create a new controller. Yeah, we'd probably just put it, if it's going to be basically a static page, we're not dealing with any data really, probably we could just put it in the index controller. So what method are we going to use for it? Get, post, put, or delete? Yeah, we're just going to use a get method. Just going to display some content. We don't need a form. I'm not deleting anything. So I'll just make a comment. So we use our express router that we've declared on line 2. So what method do we want to call? It actually shows up in the little my context menu. Yeah, we want to call the get method. So what's the path going to be? So when we get a request, a get request at localhost 3000/about. Now our express generator, also the syntax is a bit old. It used the word function, which is okay, but our simpler way of doing that is simply, instead of the word function, we can use the fat arrow or the lambda expression instead. Just a different syntax, a little shorter. If you want to use the syntax with the word function, that's fine, or we can leave it out and replace it with the lambda. So what should we do inside this method? Well, do we want to render index? So we want to render a view called about. We'll start with that. So save your change. Go back to your browser and load localhost 3000/about. What happens when you go to that URL? Fails. Why does it fail? Right, because we're trying to load a view called about. There is no file in the views folder called about.hbs. So the first part is set up the controller method to map the path and call the view. But the second step is we have to build the view. We have to do this manually. It's not like in Visual Studio where you can right click the method name and say create view, and it does it. We have to actually build it ourselves. So we'll go to views. I'll right click. I'm going to create I don't have an HBS template here, I don't think. That's okay. I'll just create a new file for now and call it about.hbs. So make sure we give it that HBS extension. And it'll just create a blank file. And in here, I'll just put on an H1 tag for now. And I'll put in simple heading. And then I'll go back to my browser and try again. So now I'll go to localhost 3000/about. So creating a new page is a two-step process. Create the view with an HBS extension and create a method somewhere in your controller that will render that view when the URL you want is called. Now notice there's no title here. At localhost 3000, we get this title in the browser tab. We don't get it here. How come? If we look at these two files, so here's my home page. Here's my about. Blair? We're close. It's not, the title tag isn't in this file, because notice even on index, this is the body, right? The title tag is actually in the HTML header. That lives in our layout file. So on our home page, we've got it. In our about page, we don't. So it's actually, let's look at the controller. Right. Right. So it's displayed in the layout, but it gets passed from the controller. Right. In our home page, we're saying render the index view and pass in a title variable. So what would we need to do down here to include a title? Right. We'd need to pass in a little JSON object with a title variable. I'll just absolutely, we're going to in a minute, right? Just to, here, right? All of this stuff I've highlighted. So notice our res.render, everything you see highlighted in blue, this is all the stuff that's passed to the view. So we've got a title, we've got one list of data, we've got a second list of data, we've got information about the user, so we can display their name and evaluate their permissions. And then we've got some settings. So yes, we can pass as much stuff as we want. So that's where we're going. So we're going to pass the title, and then we'll try and actually pass a list of data. So if we save this now and go back, Now it has our title here as well. So it's kind of like, if we, again, I'm going to continue comparing to what we're familiar with ASP.NET. Creating the view is more work because in ASP.NET, we can get Visual Studio to create the view for us. Here you have to do it all manually. However, when we're passing data in ASP.NET, we can really only return one thing, return a list of customers or return a single student. In Express, you can pass whatever you want, right? So we can pass a whole bunch of different data, values, and collections. It's all just sent as JSON. Yeah, I guess technically we could use the view bag in that way. True. It's a good point, Ryan. So now we've got 2 pages, 2 dynamic pages. So now, Ari, I want to do exactly what you're suggesting. Not only do I want to pass a title, I want to pass a simple list. Maybe we want to display on this page all of the countries that together we're from. So we want to create that list. Normally that list would come from a database, but we can hard code the list in our controller, pass it to the view, and then we'll use a loop structure with handlebars to output all of the countries on our about page. So I can just put in a comma after the title, and typically we'll break it into another line. I'll create a second variable. I'll just call it countries. Okay, where's everybody from? Let's make a list. We've got a super diverse international class, which is cool. You're from Barrie? Okay, so that's one country. We may have to adjust the syntax a little bit. What other countries do we have students from? Where else? Any other countries? Any others we can add? I don't want anybody to feel excluded. Sorry? Iran? Sure. Could even be, even if you're were born here, where your family's from. Okay, we can certainly add to the list. Is there anything, any other place we should add for now? Really, you're free to add any list you like, but as I said, I want to include everybody. Korea. Vietnam, yes. Making sure you're paying attention. Okay, we can certainly add to the list. If I've missed anybody or you didn't feel like speaking up, you can always send me an email and I'll quietly add you to the list. So now we want to add some code to our about HBS where we want to use a loop to create a list where we can display all of these values. We may have to play with the syntax a little bit here. Put on any kind of text you like. And then I'll just create an unordered list, and we can use a loop to display. So we're going to need some handlebars code here, some server-side code. So we'll open up. And we'll just use the structure each. So we want to loop through, and my code editor will close the tag. And in here, we'll first put in a set of li tags. And then how would we output each value? So we can try this. So for each element in our list of countries, we'll display the current element's name. We'll try this. We may have to adjust our syntax a bit, either here or in our controller. We'll give it a try and see how it goes. And personally, I kind of like the handlebars tags. It makes it pretty easy to tell the server-side values and distinguish them from the HTML markup. So if you adjust your list in your controller and refresh your page, you should get different data. So our controller's passing two things here. We're passing the title, which shows up here, and we're passing a list of data, which is being rendered in our loop using our list. Does anybody have any questions so far about using the generator? Okay, it's 5 to 10. What I will create a new Git repository for this, and I will push everything we've done so far up to GitHub. We can do what we're going to do a little more with this, and then next week we'll start working with MongoDB and looking at how do we connect this, and then how can we start creating and storing our list of food items in the database. And then how do we read them out, edit, delete, we'll add security and all those other good things. Okay. We'll take a break here.